Good evening, welcome. My name is Sean Ulmer. I'm Executive Director here at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. And I want to thank you for joining me for another episode of One Night Stand. This is where we look at one work by one artist for one night. It's a short program by design, about 20 minutes or so, but it gives us a chance to look in a very focused way at a specific work that either from the collection or that's on view. And I'm going to share my screen now and bring that work up. And there we go. There we go. Okay, wonderful. So welcome again to One Night Stand. Tonight we're going to be looking at Lawrence Buck's St. Paul's United Methodist Church, dated to 1918. I want to, there we go. I want to show you that work right here and explain to you just a little bit about why I selected this piece. First of all, this is a piece that you can see at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art right now. It's part of an exhibition called Inspired by Cedar Rapids, 175 Years of Art. This is an exhibition that we drew together to celebrate the 175th anniversary of the city of Cedar Rapids. And in this exhibition, this three-gallery exhibition, you'll see a wide variety of work by primarily local artists, but not exclusively, as you'll see in the case here of Lawrence Buck, but of the people, places, and things that have really been important and influential and has made an impact on the history of Cedar Rapids. And our curator, Julia Jessen, included this work in the exhibition. It is a work that is on loan to us from St. Paul's United Methodist Church. It came to us as a loan in 1984, and we do exhibit it on occasion, but because it is a gouache and pencil on board, meaning a paper board, it cannot be on view all the time. We treat all of our works on paper like we do fiber arts and other materials very carefully. Works on paper are particularly susceptible to light, to long exposures of light. So it's not a work that's, so we don't keep our works on paper on view for extended periods of time. And we bring them out periodically. This is one of those works, being on a paper board. It is susceptible to light as well. And so this is not a work that gets out all the time, but we have shown it a number of times because it fits in well with some of our thematic shows. In this case, our exhibition called Inspired by Cedar Rapids. Another reason why I chose this work to focus on tonight is because I drive by this building every single day on my way into work. And the route that I take takes me right by this building and this wonderful church, and I love seeing it every morning on my drive in. And so I have a personal connection to the building as well, and also because it is a building that was, for all intents and purposes, designed by Louis Sullivan, the famous Chicago architect. Who deserves to be better known than he is today, but it is a real rare treat to have in a city a work by Louis Sullivan. And in fact, as I will show later, we're fortunate to have more than one work by Louis Sullivan in this city. So those are some of the reasons why I selected this particular work to focus on. I'll give you a bigger view of it, a little bit better view of it, but it's really a pale comparison to experiencing the piece in person. I do have some details coming up that will show you some of the wonderful, remarkable details in the work that you would enjoy by coming in and seeing this in person. I should also mention that the exhibition that it's in, Inspired by Cedar Rapids, is our large fall exhibition. And it will be on view through the holidays. That exhibition closes on January 19th. So there's ample time to get in to see it, but because it is the holidays, people get very, very busy. So certainly make a plan to come in and see it. Excuse me. Here is the church itself, and you can see it's a little bit different than the painting of the church, and I'll go into detail on that as well. But it is a really wonderful massing of elements and lots of interesting things going on in this structure. A few more shots from 3rd Avenue, and you can see that it is on the corner there, so it has kind of this wonderful wraparound vista in a way that you can see it from many different sides. You can actually completely circumnavigate the building, but as you're driving by, if you're not stopping, you can see a lot of the building because it is situated so well on this particular corner. Here, another view of it, and there will be more views of it further on in the presentation, but I wanted to get you a sense of the monumentality of the building, of the impressiveness of the structure, of the kind of statement it makes, even though it does depart a bit from Lawrence Buck's painting of it. And here, in one of our fair days here in Cedar Rapids, a beautiful view of it. This from the other side of the semicircular apseal, I guess, a space that you see behind it, that semicircular form, which really holds, oh, here, I forgot I put this view in as well. Here from the direct side, you can see it's really, it is a massing of various geometric forms, squarish forms and blocks, towers, semicircular forms, all wonderfully integrated together. Each different space is dedicated to a different function in the church, and that very much follows Louis Sullivan's dictate that form should follow function. He's famous for having said that. He didn't invent that, but he's famous for having said that. And you can see that each of these forms in this building has a very specific function. Here, a view of the interior, a wedding, at holiday time even, gives you a sense of the wonderful space of the interior. I won't be spending any time talking about the interior of the building, really focused on the exterior in relationship to the painting itself. So just before I get into some of the more specifics on the painting, a little bit about St. Paul's United Methodist Church. It is very much a part of Cedar Rapids history. It began actually in 1840 in the Listaberger cabin, where a group of people would gather and they would listen to travelers, itinerant preachers who would come through Cedar Rapids and preach sermons, and they would do so in the Listaberger cabin. But then an actual congregation formed 3 years later in 1843, a congregation of Methodists. So from that group, they actually formalized a congregation, and they continued to meet in that cabin until 1856, when the little brick church was built on Green Square, and that is where the Methodists met until 1873. When they needed a larger church. So they built a larger church at the intersection of 4th Avenue and 5th Street. But because of the financial panic of the era and the subsequent depression of the 1870s, the structure was not completed until 1878. And that's where the Methodist Church lived until 1910. When they launched a competition for a new St. Paul's, and that competition was awarded to Louis Sullivan. He designed the structure at more than twice the budget, which was a problem, and so was asked to redesign or work on his designs to get it more in keeping with the budget. He did revise the designs, simplified them, but it was still too high, and so it just really wasn't within the budget of the church to complete Sullivan's full design. And so rather than compromise any further, he withdrew from the commission in 1912. And then William C. Jones was hired by the church to continue to work on Sullivan's designs. He simplified them further and kept them to within the $100,000 budget, which was a lot of money in 1912, the $100,000 budget to build the building. George Elmsey of Purcell, Fike, and Elmsey, who was also another competitor for the project. George Elmsey served as a consultant. He was well familiar with Sullivan's designs, and Sullivan the architect. They knew each other very well. And he served as a consultant to try and make sure that the final project still was along Sullivan's intent, his imagination, and so he served to kind of make sure that Sullivan's vision was somewhat realized in the building, and to a large extent it certainly was. The building was finally dedicated in 1914, and we're going to look next at this wonderful painting of the building itself. So at the very top of the building, you see this work by Lawrence Buck, I should say, really reflects Sullivan's design for the building, what Sullivan wanted the building to look like. We'll talk a little bit more about Sullivan and his aesthetic in a minute, but I want to look first at the actual painting itself, which is a gouache and pencil on a paperboard. Here's the tower itself. You can see with these wonderful angels with trumpets. You can see that there's color up there, probably through terracotta. Sullivan was well known for using colored terracotta as decorative elements. You can see a lot of detail work there. Further down the tower, you can see as you look at the semicircular apsial form. Here you can see lots of decorative elements adorning this large massing of architecture. Here over one of the entrances, you can see also just sort of the implication of color as well. Again, probably through terracotta tiles, one imagines, given other work that Sullivan did. Here another detail. These details are not just about Sullivan's original designs. It's also about Lawrence Buck's ability to take drawings, to take floor plans and realize them in the third dimension. Lawrence Buck, whom we'll speak about in a minute as well, is a consummate artist here. He is taking basically floor plans that Louis Sullivan created and trying to visualize them, to realize them in three-dimensional form on paperboard. This is a fairly significantly sized piece. It's some 40 inches wide, so it's a pretty big piece, and does so in a way that really is beyond just representing the architecture, but has gone to really an artistic level. Here, you can tell he really knows how to handle gouache and pencil in this case, and you can also see there's some charcoal work in here as well. You can see Buck has populated this image with figures to kind of give you a sense of scale, people interacting with the architecture. Here a detail of them. They're just sketched in. It's really not about the figures, but the figures are an important player as well. Here's some more detail work that gives you sort of a sense of his working with pencil, with charcoal, with gouache pigment as well. And here another detail. It's one of those paintings that you can look at and just continue to pick out details the longer that you spend with it. And so I certainly encourage those of you who are interested to come on down and take a look at this in person, because these images are a nice sort of taste of the work, but you really need to experience it in person. Here, again, sort of showing that upper level of windows, which were to be faced with these wonderful Verde green columns with these yellow or gold-like capitals. Again, most of this would have probably been realized in a glazed terracotta, which was one of the elements that Sullivan used, and would have made sense in this case. And here yet another really remarkable detail that shows not only the kinds of decorative qualities that Sullivan was intending for this building, but also Lawrence Buck's ability to handle the medium, to handle the pigment and on the paper. And here a wonderful little anecdotal detail of an automobile outside St. Paul's, just sort of really kind of to complete the whole vignette of the work. And on a particularly beautiful morning drive in, I stopped to take some pictures that I thought would relate well to Lawrence Buck's painting of it. So here, kind of really standing at the corner, looking at it. One of the two entrances on this side, there's a mirror image entrance on the other side as well of the rounded form. Gives you kind of a sense of how all of these different masses all fit together. Here, a look at the sort of the tower itself. And you can see there is articulation, there is decoration. It's just been greatly simplified by the subsequent, architect and consultant. You have to look very carefully at the structure itself, and you see some of the wonderful ornamentation, not to the elaborate degree that Louis Sullivan may have originally intended, but it's still many of these forms are here. Here you can see the tower itself. For a little bit more from underneath, so that you can see that there are no trumpeting angels here, but there is articulation, very kind of linear articulation, and then lots of wonderful little details that one finds, here running right underneath the roof line, wonderful, and then just even this little strip work. And these little wonderful little recesses here that catch the light. Now at this point, of course, the sun is hitting it pretty solidly, so you can't see it as well in this photograph. But there's lots of wonderful little planes and levels that will pick out the light during the course of the day. So there is articulation of the surface, just not in the same way that Sullivan had originally intended. Here, a sense of the massing as well. Wonderful intersection of volumes, basically. And I put it in juxtaposition with a detail from the painting. So you can see how Sullivan originally had intended this particular area, and then how it looks today, or how it looked when it was dedicated in 1914. Here, one of the entrances, the one further to the east. Here's sort of the rounding of the sanctuary space. And you can see that that there are windows that are articulated with a wonderful series of linear patterns. And so really the decoration becomes much more linear as opposed to organic. From what Sullivan had originally intended. But you can see again, wonderful detail work, a lot of articulation here. It's just very, very subtle. And gone, of course, is, or never realized, I should say, is that colonnade that I mentioned earlier. Here, a little bit better detail where you can see a bit of the of the decorative elements. Again, very linear, and then you can see the linear design of the windows inside. And here another sort of view overall of the painting that Lawrence Buck created of the original intention, the original design by Louis Sullivan. And here how it looks overall today. So who was Louis Sullivan? Why does he matter? Well, Louis Sullivan was an extraordinarily important architect working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He has been dubbed the father of the skyscraper because he really pushed the limits of height in a lot of his works, not in the St. Paul's church, but in other works that he created. He didn't invent the skyscraper, and there were many architects working at the same time who were exploring new technologies and new materials to reach ever higher heights. But Sullivan is the one who is most associated with really pushing the envelope at this very early stage of sort of the growth and the development of the skyscraper. He was also famous for having said that form follows function. The form of the building should really reflect the function that is within. Now, he is greatly credited with having come up with that expression, but actually there are analogous statements, even in ancient texts along the same line. And most famously, even just before Sullivan's time, Viollet-le-Duc, who was a famous French architect, was famous for having said very much basically the same thing: form follows function. Here are two pictures of Louis Sullivan. He was born in Boston to a Swiss-born mother and an Irish-born father. Who had immigrated to the United States in the 1840s, so they were fresh in the United States shortly before Louis Sullivan was born. He was a very good student and very advanced. He actually entered MIT at the age of 16. He didn't stay there long. He studied architecture a little bit, but after about a year at MIT, he moves to Philadelphia and he takes the job with the architect Frank Furness. Shortly thereafter, though, in 1873, due to the Depression of 1873 that I referenced earlier, the commissions dried up, and Sullivan finds his way over to Chicago. In Chicago, architecture is booming. It's going crazy. There's a huge amount of growth in Chicago because of the fire of 1871. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 wiped out a large portion of the city, and so they were in a growth spurt, and it was a great place to be if you were a budding architect. And so Sullivan arrives in Chicago in 1873. He works for various firms. He even takes a year off and studies in Paris, comes back to Chicago, and in 1879, he is hired by architect Dankmar Adler. And a year later, he becomes partner with Adler. And it's during this time, in the 1880s, that Adler and Sullivan hire the young Frank Lloyd Wright, who worked at the firm for 6 years directly under Louis Sullivan, and Sullivan mentored the young Frank Lloyd Wright, which is another reason why Sullivan is particularly important. Now, they did have a bit of a falling out. Frank Lloyd Wright was taking some jobs on the side on his own time, but Sullivan felt that was a violation of their contract, and whether Wright quit or was dismissed is unclear, but they did separate ways somewhat acrimoniously, and it took a good 2 decades before they made up and became friends again. But during this, the 6-year period, very, very important for Frank Lloyd Wright. He never stopped calling Sullivan his beloved mentor, his beloved master, and he always felt indebted to Louis Sullivan. Here, I want to show you a work by Adler and Sullivan, one of the more famous buildings that they created. They achieved great fame early as an architectural firm through their theater projects. They were famous for doing a lot of theater projects, particularly in Chicago, but elsewhere. The auditorium building that I show you here does have a 4,200 seat theater inside of it, as well as a hotel and an office building and a tower that you see there. And so this is, from the 1880s, the late 1880s. This is actually a pretty tall building for that period. Buildings were made either of brick or masonry of stone. And in order to support the weight of the upper floors, the walls at the ground level had to be super thick because it really had to bear all of that weight. And so you couldn't get very high. And you couldn't have very big windows. The windows tended to be small. And you can see that they employed a variety of architectural techniques to kind of channel that weight. I mean, these round-headed arches that you see are channeling things down to various piers, which bear the bulk of the weight. But you're not getting super high. But this is actually one of the first of many of the higher buildings in Chicago, because it is employing a steel armature, or if you will, which is just beginning to be popularized at this time. There was, in the latter half of the 19th century, the development of an inexpensive, versatile steel that allowed architects to build taller and taller buildings and open up the walls for more and more windows. And then the interior walls become thinner, which allows more usable space on the inside, as well as, at the same time, more rentable space. And so here's sort of that first sort of development, really kind of testing how far can we take things. So that, not too long after that, in the 1890s, Adler and Sullivan are designing buildings like the Guarantee Building in Buffalo, where you can see that they're really, really employing the steel armature, and they're cladding that armature in brick or in stone. But it doesn't need to be thick, because the weight of the floors, the weight of the architecture is actually being borne by steel. And so you can see this one really, races to the sky, and all of these verticals really accentuate the verticality of the building, the height of the building, as you see here. So you can see quite a development even from the late 1880s into the 1890s. And then, here Louis Sullivan, who is on his own at this point, in a work from the late 90s and the early aughts, the Carson Peary Scott department store has really opened up the floors. It's all windows. Everything is really being borne by the steel armature. And this is one of the things that Louis Sullivan is famous for having done, is really understanding the potential of a steel armature and then running away with it. And so he, however, Sullivan, was not satisfied with that. As we see in the painting by Lawrence Buck, Louis Sullivan loves the decorative. And so on these, and these are just 3 buildings, some with Adler, some on his own, after he had his own firm. On these buildings, he adds decorative elements. So for example, on the left here, this is some of the wonderful terracotta cladding that's on top of the Guarantee Building. And on the right, you see some of this wonderful bronze work that's at the rounded entrance to the Carson Peary Scott store. And so he loves to add on the surface of them where they're not, these walls are not needed for holding up the building, so they can be played with. He really loves to add in elements, these very decorative elements of from Art Nouveau or from Celtic Revival traditions, and they're usually in either cast iron or in terracotta. They range from organic forms that you can certainly see here, such as vines and ivy, to more geometric designs and interlace that might be inspired by his heritage, his Irish heritage. In his later career, let me back up here just a second. In his later career, due to the panic of 1893, commissions began to dry up again. They were very volatile economic times. There was the Depression of the 1870s and the Panic of the 1890s. He dissolves his partnership with Adler in 1894, and then his next big commission was the Carson Peary Scott store that I mentioned. But after that, only a few major commissions, and it really began a 20-year financial and emotional decline for Sullivan. There was a shortage of commissions. He had chronic financial problems, and he was battling alcoholism, which made it very difficult for him to complete a lot of his commissions. What he ended up doing mostly for the last 20 years of his life were small banks in the Midwest, throughout the Midwest, and he wrote books. And he passes away in 1924 in a Chicago hotel room. I also wanted to include another sort of notable thing is that Sullivan did very few churches. There are only really 3 churches known to still exist. It was not a type of building that Sullivan did very frequently. And so here I show one from 1890 that he did while he was still working with Adler. This is the Pilgrim Baptist Church in Chicago. It was unfortunately destroyed by a fire in January of 2006. They are in the process of rebuilding it, but this is what they have to start with. So not a whole lot to work from. They basically only have the shell, and so there's a lot of the Adler and Sullivan interior is gone. I also wanted to show this one from 1903. This is Louis Sullivan's Holy Trinity Russian Orthodox Cathedral and Rectory, also in Chicago. You can see it's very, very traditional and very, very much, according to the function. And then there's this one, St. Paul's United Methodist Church in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And this is, and so in that way, it makes this building even all the more important because he did very, very few ecclesiastical buildings. And so the fact that it remains today, even though it's been doesn't have the same decorative elements that Sullivan originally intended for the building, it's all the more important because it really does still reflect his massing, his form follow function dictum. But it is not the only Sullivan building in Cedar Rapids. At the same time he was working on the project for St. Paul's, he was actually also designing one of those small banks in the Midwest. This is Louis Sullivan's People's Savings Bank here in Cedar Rapids, further down the 3rd Avenue. And you can see it is a small bank building with windows all around, and this middle section that pops up, which allows clear story windows, further windows to illuminate the space. It does have some terracotta decorative elements on it. It was not a heavily decorated building or ever intended to be a heavily decorated building, but you can see that between the brick strip work and these wonderful geometric decorative elements, here another example of that. And you can see here a little bit of that vining, where it feels like that vining with the symbol that you see at the center of this piece, and it actually is basically the P, the S, and the B. for People's Savings Bank. So he takes the three letters of the building's name and makes them quite ornate and decorative and puts them into this design here. But it's not the only bank in Iowa. Here's the Henry Adams building, which was also, it was actually really a kind of a savings and loan. It was a bank-like building. It was a financial building here in Algona from 1913. So after he withdrew from the St. Paul's Project. Here again, you see a lot of decorative work, but mostly with the play with the brick, a little bit of glazed terracotta there, and tile work that you see. And here's some of that wonderful glazed tile work. Again, very geometric. And then Louis Sullivan's Merchants National Bank in Grinnell, nearby Grinnell, a magnificent bank building. You can see it is, again, mostly brick, but there are terracotta elements. And here you see some really wonderful decorative qualities around the entrance primarily. And I've got some details so you can see a combination of both geometric and vegetal forms. Kind of that blending of the two gives you a real good sense of, of what he was really capable of when he kind of sunk his teeth into the decorative qualities here. And it just seems to be sort of just adhered to the front of this brick structure. And we have a more commercial building, a non-bank building here, the Van Allen building in Clinton, Iowa from 1914. All of these are in this, really from 1911 to 1914. These are the kinds of commissions he was getting at this point in his career. And again, you see, it's not a very tall building. Probably wasn't a call for that in the commission, but it is stacked up. You got the retail on the first floor, like many of his commercial buildings, and then office spaces up above. And this building is fortunate to have some of that colored terracotta that you see kind of at the top and the bottom of these columns, as well as some wonderful decorative terracotta on the surface itself. Here a little bit closer view, and the V and the A for Van Allen is integrated into it, just as you saw the PS and B for People's Savings Bank. So Lawrence Buck, I don't have a photo of Lawrence Buck. I'm sure there is one of him out there somewhere. I just wasn't able to find one. But he was more or less about of the same generation as Louis Sullivan. I think Louis Sullivan was 9 years older and passed away about 5 years before Lawrence Buck. Lawrence Buck was born in New Orleans. His father was a landscape painter, so he kind of grew up in an artistic environment. But he was trained as a draftsman. His father passes away, and he gets trained as a draftsman. And in 1884, at the 1884 World Industrial and Cotton Centennial, he meets the French architect Edouard Sedel. And he assists Sedel in commissions for the Caldwell Hotel and for the Morris Building in Birmingham, Alabama. So he starts working very early on in architecture. He forms a partnership with A.J. Armstrong, and they work together on this very successful competition for the Fort Worth Trade Building in 1909. It's probably the most famous work that Armstrong and Buck did together. Armstrong ends up moving to Texas. Buck stays in Alabama, and he forms a new partnership with architect John Sutcliffe. In 1889, Sutcliffe moves to Chicago, and Buck follows him. In Chicago, Buck becomes part of a young group of Chicago architects that are sometimes called the 18. They are friends of other architects as well, including Frank Lloyd Wright and some of his friends. And all of these group of the 18 had their offices in Steinway Hall. Buck continued to keep his office there through the 1920s. Buck is influenced by the prairie style, which Frank Lloyd Wright advocated, but not exclusively. He didn't adhere to one particular style like Frank Lloyd Wright did, for example. But you can see in some of Buck's work the Tudor style, arts and crafts style, the English cottage style of architecture, as well as colonial revival in his work. He becomes very, very popular as an architect, with his designs featured in Ladies' Home Journal and House Beautiful. He passes away in 1929 in Ravinia, Illinois. I want to show one of Buck's pieces of architecture, 4 mounds, in Dubuque, Iowa, from around 1909. And you can see he did do commercial work, but he really is probably better known for some of his domestic architecture. This being one. He also designed the John Ely residence in Cedar Rapids. It's no longer extant. This was the original image that I had to work from, but and you can see the floor plan there, and a not so good image of the structure. And I was able to happily find this photograph of the Ely house. It's no longer extant. It was taken down for the building of Blair House. It was right on First Avenue, the main drag here in Cedar Rapids. And you can see that it is not really prairie style, but more that arts and crafts and maybe a little smack of English cottage in there as well. And so it's sort of a typical example of his architecture style. But we know him as a painter, the painter of the St. Paul's United Methodist Church painting. I happened to stumble upon another painting, one that was recently at auction. And here's another example of Buck's painting work. So he was equally adept at doing these paintings of architecture, like St. Paul's, like this untitled piece that you see here. Again, with the same sort of loose brushwork when it comes to automobiles and people, a little bit more attention paid to the particulars of the architecture. And so you take a look at what he did with St. Paul's, a much more finished, realized work. He, at this time, must have been working with Sullivan in some capacity to do this rendering based on Sullivan's floor plans. And as such, I would say that the date that the piece purportedly has of 1918 is probably wrong. It's probably more likely that this piece dates from the time that Sullivan was involved with the St. Paul United Methodist Church project. So I would probably date this painting to somewhere between 1910 and 1912, probably more likely between 1910 and 1911, when Sullivan was actively working on the project and probably wanted a rendering of the church to show to the church leaders in Cedar Rapids of what the church would look like when completed. So I think the date that we have for the piece of 1918 is probably off a bit by maybe as much as 8 years. And Buck, who was obviously an architect as well, must have been working with Sullivan in some capacity, maybe in a freelance capacity, to create this rendering while Sullivan was working on another project. So I think that we need to redate the piece to an earlier period, I wanted to share with you also a few other images. Was able to find a few postcards of St. Paul's from right around 1920. So it's not it's not a situation where where this church was ornamented, and then the ornamentation was taken down. It never had it. It was, from all accounts, from all of the records regarding the building of the church, it was originally planned to have all of this exterior ornamentation. However, he went way over budget, more than double, and even when he simplified it, he was still well over budget, and so withdrew from the project. But the general massing of the building very much follows exactly what Sullivan had planned for the structure. Here, another early postcard from around 1920. Which would have been shortly after it was dedicated in 1914. So it was just really, these elements never existed on the building. Here you can still see the trolley lines in this postcard, or here a much later postcard in color. And one interesting thing, side note here, is that this building was actually photographed. These 4 photographs by Aaron Siskin and students of the Institute of Design in Chicago. They were sent out to take a photographic record of Louis Sullivan's ecclesiastic and educational buildings. And so Aaron Siskin, who's a very remarkable and famous photographer, was one of those that were sent out. And here are the 4 images that they took of St. Paul's. So it has its own place in photographic history as well as architectural history. And so I wanted to share with you some of those wonderful photographs. And so here are photographers who are trying to capture what it is that makes a Sullivan church building special. And these are the things that they chose to focus on. These are the views that they felt really captured Sullivan's spirit in these works. So I think that is my last slide, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and be happy to. I've gone over my allotted 20 minutes. I apologize. Be happy to answer some questions that I might be able to for you. But just unmute yourself, or I don't see anything in the chat. So if you would like to ask a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself.
This is Gail.
Yes.
I certainly compliment you on your research. I've heard more about the church than I have before, and particularly about Sullivan and the artist. So congratulations. It was informative. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's a much bigger topic than even what I was able to present. I was really trying to keep it short. So, Sullivan's, too long to go into. He's a huge career, and there's a lot to dig into there. Buck's a little bit more elusive as a maker, a little bit harder to get information. We have biographical information and some of his buildings. I mean, he really was very, very productive, but it wasn't, but not as much as a painter. So very little is known about him as a painter. So the fact that he has clearly signed this painting of St. Paul's makes it all the more special. The painting all the more special because it wasn't something, he certainly was adept at it, and he probably did do others, but I don't think that they exist. I don't think they survive. So there's only, I really wasn't able to find much out there that he had created that was, in the painting vein. So, but yeah, it's a very big topic. It's a very rich history of St. Paul's itself, very rich history in architecture. Louis Sullivan, not just in this building, but in several buildings in Iowa. We're very fortunate to have several works by Sullivan in Iowa. Fortunate to have several works by Frank Lloyd Wright in Iowa. There was it's really a wonderful area for finding some really remarkable pieces of architecture.
Yes, I've seen the bank in Owatonna, Minnesota. It's a little more elaborate than the one in Grinnell.
Absolutely, yeah. That's usually the first one that's mentioned, and so that's a good one to bring up. But yeah, that was one of the kind of the key banks that he did later in his career.
Certainly good to have Buck's painting of the gingerbread because we would have not known about it if it weren't for that picture.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's one thing, I mean, it's one thing to see things on floor plans and that sort of thing, but then to see it sort of really realized in sort of a three-dimensional fashion, and with color, and I imagine that Sullivan was standing right next to Buck, probably, guiding him on what colors to use, I mean, those sorts of things. They don't get translated in floor plans, or even in elevations as they do in a painting. So the question in the chat about how St. Paul's acquired the painting and when I do not know the answer to that question, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this was something that they acquired at the time that Sullivan made, the proposal or made the, in the competition. And when they decided to go with him and commission him to create the church, I imagine it, along with other documents, floor plans, and so forth, all ended up in the possession of the church. Even though that's not how the church ended up looking, he did work with them for 2 years before ultimately withdrawing from the project. And so I imagine, he left those materials with the church, and they probably, and they no doubt paid him for his time and efforts working in those 2 years, and so that might have been part of the outcome of that commission, is that they ended up with the floor plans in this particular painting. So that would be just a guess. I'm going out on a limb, but I imagine that it came with the commission. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you all for joining me this month for One Night Stand. It is a monthly program. This presentation will be loaded up to our YouTube channel if you want to view it again and hear something again that you might have missed. But all of our One Night Stands are loaded onto our YouTube channel, so there might be other works that we focus on for one night that are of interest to you. I do appreciate you joining me this evening, and we'll see you again real soon. Do come down and take a look at the work in person. That's always the best way to see it. There's a lot of wonderful, rich detail in that painting that's well worth your time. So thank you all for joining me, and have a good rest of your evening.